Hello, and a very warm welcome to you all here. I'm here in Britain, and we're broadcasting live at this moment in time from our studios. So, good morning to you. As I said, I'm based in Portsmouth, and a good morning to you all out there. Can't seem to get my words out today, and hope you're all having a great day. Well, what a week it's been already. We've had some crazy stuff going on in Great Britain this week with a big farmers' protest that's been going on in London. And it just seems that our current Labour government just seem to be going from strength to strength. Glory be to God. Forgive my sarcasm. But it does seem that they keep making mistakes, of which people keep complaining about, of which they never seem to back down. So it's good for me. I've got a friend, and he works in TV, and he's having a whale of a time at the moment. A few months back, he was like, I'm so bored. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to report about. But since Labour have come to power, he's been kept a busy man, so he's happy. So as always, we like to start the show with a little bit of news. But before I do, I just want to recommend a book that I've been reading this week, which is this one here. It's called Living in Wonder by a guy called Rob Dreher. And it's a really good book. And I'm going to kind of bring some of the things out a little bit later in the show, where I'm going to be talking about recapturing the mystery of God. Because from my own personal sort of testimony of how I came to Christ, from witchcraft to Christ, I had a certain kind of perspective on life that's never really quite left me. And I kind of brought that into my Christian faith. And so this book is really kind of addressing, for Christians to really come back to the weirdness of Christianity and the supernatural of Christianity. This is a really, really good book. Highly recommend it. It's about £16, but it's one of those books that you read it and it leaves you with a sense of wonder at the world in which you're living in. And it's highly impactful, very intelligently written as well, which is great. Okay, so this week then, let's have a quick look at the news, shall we? So I always think it's quite funny what's going on. We've covered a few sort of major stories of late. This has been, well, I wouldn't call it a big story, but it's certainly one that could potentially cause us problems down the line. So with the farmers, they're not happy about this 20% inheritance tax that's been added to them. Consequently, that means that later on down the line, it means that they can't really pass on their farms to their children, things like that. And so the farmers have kind of alluded, probably warned and threatened that they will stop growing food if the government keeps going down the track that it's going. And obviously, if the farmers don't grow food, that's a problem, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Spain, where they had loads of floods recently, that wiped out masses of their greenhouses, which is where all our salads and things like that come from. And so also, as I said in one of the other shows, with the nut zero policies, farming in general is right down on its crop output, purely for the fact that the government is subsidizing farmers to not grow anything because it's bad for the environment. I mean, what utter nonsense. I know, let's pay people to not do farming because it's bad for the environment and we'll all starve instead. Well, I suppose ultimately it's good for the environment. If humanity dies out, well, then the earth will be intact and good. Except that's not what the Bible says, and that's how it plays out in the end. Just crazy world that we live in, but exciting times to be in as Christians, if we can get our act together. Anyway, so just some news here. This is from the Daily Telegraph. So Angela Rayner has refused to rule out a further inheritance tax raid on farmers despite a mounting backlash. And it needs to be noted that Labour, Keir Starmer himself actually promised to the Farmers Union there would be no land grabbing, no inheritance tax, nothing to worry about. It's all good. As long as you get us through the door, get Labour into power, we promise you we'll be there for our farmers. Right. Okay. So they backed down on that. So they soon made an about turn on those promises. And again, another thing about Labour is that they just don't listen to the public. And so Angela Rayner, she's refused to rule out further inheritance tax raids on farmers despite a mounting backlash. So people are not happy about this. The Deputy Prime Minister declined to directly answer when she was questioned in Parliament over whether there could be further increases to the inheritance tax burden. So there's potentially more stuff that's coming down the line. Now, I appreciate people saying that, well, we need to make these cuts because It's important that we do these cuts so it will help the NHS. But there's a lot of money that could be pulled back from other places, namely some of this nut zero stuff where they're just pouring billions into it. They could use some of that money for the NHS. So, a source involved in talks with the government over tax changes suggested options on the table may include raising the inheritance tax burden for farmers. Farmers face a 20% inheritance tax bill on assets valued at more than 1 million under changes that will come into effect from April 2026. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has refused to back down in a growing row with farmers over the so-called tractor tax, arguing that around 75% of farming estates will avoid paying. And on it goes. So obviously this week, because of all of this kind of stuff that's been going on, there's been sort of protests in London. My daughter went to that because she works in agriculture. She's in an agricultural college, and she wants to do farming as a career when she gets a little bit older. I wouldn't call it a career, but there we go. That's what she wants to do, because we run a thing called a prayer farm. So she's kind of got the bug for farming and things like that. And so she was at this protest. I would have been at the protest. My wife would have been at the protest. But you know what? There's been so many protests lately. I can't keep up with them all. And we have other things to get on with as well. So I got some footage here of what went on in London, just a few minutes worth, and a few interviews.
You say to Rachel Reeves about her 73% of farms won't be affected, whereas DEFRA is saying it could be 66.
Well, look,
CLA saying it could be 70,000 farms affected.
Who knows what the number truly is? All I do know is somebody at the Treasury's got their sums wrong, because the people that survive this intacto are effectively small holdings, right? Which I think the government have included in their figures. Small holdings that are giant agribusinesses, and the irony that so much of the land that families will have to sell will get bought by foreign corporations who pay almost no tax here anyway, seems to have escaped everybody. So, no, I think this is, I would view today as being just the beginning of what's going to become a rural revolt, a British revolt, not violent or anything like that, but I think it's time that the countryside stood up.
And what's the solution? What do rural Labour MPs have to do to fight for their constituencies?
Well,
and farmers?
That's why this is winnable. We're up to 100 Labour seats are in rural or semi-rural constituencies. The pressure from this, if it's sustained, is going to be very, very real. And at a minimum, there needs to be a complete rethink about the threshold level. I've got people in Clacton with 300 acres of land. Now, in theory, it's worth a fortune, but in practice, they're lucky to make 30,000 quid a year on it. Land values have gone mad. It is true that some billionaires have bought up vast tracts of land to avoid IHT, but these people shouldn't be paying the price.
For the sake of everybody here, and for all the farmers who are stuck at home today, paralysed by a fog of despair over what's been foisted upon them, I beg of the government to be big, to accept that this was rushed through, it wasn't thought out, and it's a mistake. That's the big thing to do, admit it, and back down.
So Jeremy Clarkson there, giving his 2 pennies worth. If you've ever watched that series that he did, Jeremy Clarkson's Farm, the language is a bit on the blue side, but it is very interesting, very entertaining. But nevertheless, you get to see just what it's like to be a farmer and the stress that they have to put up with and the constant unhelpfulness of a government. And it seems crazy to me that food is one of the most important things that we need to secure. There should be a Department of Food Security, but there isn't. And food is everything. It's really on a knife edge. So, for example, I had a guy, he from Asda's, came up to me the other day, and we was giving my shopping in the morning. And I said, "How's things going?" I said, "You must be getting busy because you're coming towards the Christmas time." And he was like saying, "Well, we've got a major problem with our system that's down at the moment, which has caused us to back things up, and it's really slowed things down." But he said one thing that's crazy is that the same system we use is used by multiple different companies, from mail companies, delivery companies, I think even banks. And so this one system, when it went down, brought down loads of other systems with it. And so we have this a very fragile infrastructure. And where a lot of our farming is done globally, where we get things from one country or just a few countries that come in, and where we're not really promoting and pushing homegrown vegetables and homegrown farming, but our emphasis is on the global market rather than the local market, we're actually making our food security very fragile. So a simple thing like a computer virus, it was actually hacked on purpose, this Asda software, so that people could make some money on it by saying, hey, pay a ransom. If you don't pay us this, then your system will stay down. And invariably, a lot of these companies have to pay the ransom, which is terrible. But it just shows how the fragility of our food security really is. In the good old days, I guess even like in the 1950s, 1940s, a lot of farmers grew for the local area. Now farmers grow, it then gets taken out of the country, put onto a global stock exchange market, goes out of the country, sometimes even comes back into the country way more expensive than it was. The farmers don't make any money on it. And the people that do make the money on it is the stock market investors. And you and I get to pay the additional premium at our local supermarkets. Thanks. And so basically, we need to really get behind our local farmers. It was again in the papers this week that Labour's environmental secretary, who is Steve Reed, I believe, he has visited a farm just once in 3 months in the job that he has, it's emerged. And so Steve Reed has now been dubbed City Steve by the Tories, when he actually should be spending a lot of his time with farmers, but he's not. And he's one of the ministers leading the arguments that the government's inheritance tax raid on farmers is justified. You know, it's like politicians that don't even know what the price is for a pint of milk, which, to be fair, I don't even know that myself. What is the current price for a pint of milk these days? Can you even still buy a pint of milk? I mean, who buys a pint of milk, for goodness sake? You know, we now buy 20 gallons of milk these days, especially in my house anyway. We drink it like it's going out of fashion. So basically, it's not good, right? And this is something else that as Christians, we really need to be praying for our nation. We do need to pray for our farmers. There are a lot of farmers that are going out of business every week. There are a lot of farmers that are committing suicide as well. This is a big issue. And we really do need to pay attention to food security. But it just seems that our Labour government is more obsessed with nut zero and basically making sure that we can buy up fields and stick solar panels on it and save the world from this global agenda, which, by the way, all those COP20 other countries don't want to be involved with. It's only a few countries that want to do it, and Britain's one of them. But everyone else, the big countries, they don't want to get involved. You want to know why? Because they know how much money it's going to cost the economy, and it's absolutely absurd. So instead of tanking the economy, tanking your own farming industry, and destroying your infrastructure of your country, maybe we should just move away a little bit from that. Yeah, I appreciate there may be a climate change thing, but I do believe what the Bible says about climate change, and the Bible does talk about climate change. But the reason why we have climate change is, unfortunately, in part because of man's stupidity on the earth, but also because of his sinful nature. And it's also the birth pains or the birth pangs of the signs of the times of the end of the age. So no amount of net green is or nut green is actually or nut zero is going to solve those problems. And so with these leaders that we have, it says in Isaiah 10 verses 1 to 2, it says, "What sorrow awaits the unjust judges and those who issue unfair laws. They deprive the poor of justice and deny the rights of the needy among my people." And we are seeing real injustice here amongst the farming community. It's not right. It shouldn't be done. We should be protecting our farmers. We should be standing up for the infrastructure and for food security in this nation and across Europe, actually, because it's not good. And we need to be taking this seriously. Again, this is one of the reasons why we as a church, we have our own farm, we grow our own produce and our own food, because we believe that God warned us that food security would become an issue going down the line. And now, thanks to the nut zero propaganda that's actually paying farmers to not grow crops, thanks to weather problems in Europe, and thanks now to what could potentially be going on with the farmers are downing tools and saying, well, if you're going to do this to us, we're not going to give you any food. So this is a problem. And don't get too worried. You know, it's not like this hasn't happened before. I mean, if you think in World War II, food security was a big issue, but we dug for victory. We might have to bring those days back. Proverbs 28:15, it says, "A wicked ruler is dangerous to the poor as a roaring lion or an attacking bear." Psalm 94 verses 20 to 21 says, "Can unjust leaders claim that God is on their side? Leaders whose decrees permit injustice, they gang up against the righteous and condemn the innocent to death." And again, with the the law that they want to try and pass to legislate for assisted death, which is really what it is, assisted dying bill, assisted suicide. Yeah, this is kind of, these scriptures are relevant to where we're at. How can an unjust leader claim that God is on their side when those leaders decree injustice and they gang up against the righteous, which is what they're doing? You know, these new laws that they've brought out now to stop Christians praying. Okay, my wife was reading to me last night the full legislation of some of these new kind of public banning orders that they're putting around places like abortion clinics, and it's bad. That you can have unlimited fines. They can confiscate your vehicle. They can even ban you from a city. They can do a lot of stuff. This is just complete inappropriate, over the top, and it's a beginning of persecution that will come to the church, I believe, in these days. Things are going to get rough. They will get better, I believe, for a season, but not after things go quite dark. Because I think, and I hate to say this, but I think Christians need to be faced with some harsh reality, because a lot of Christians are just not facing up to the reality. People are suffering from what I call normality bias, where the normality bias is this psychological issue where the brain's like, no, I can see what's going on in the world, but I'm not allowing it to affect my little world. So I'm just going to carry on in my little world, put my head in the sand and pretend it's all going to go away. But the thing is, this isn't going to go away. It's going to keep knocking on your door and it's going to demand your attention. You can't pretend that this is not your problem. And so Christians, we have to pray about these things. The most powerful weapon you have is prayer, but it's the weapon that the church uses the least, sadly, in these days. We need to be a people of prayer. Here, this studio is also my prayer room. And so I'm often praying for our nation, praying for our government in here. And you might think, well, I've been praying that for years and look at the state of things. Well, you don't realize, or you don't know, that sometimes in God's plans, he does things a little bit weird. Sometimes people need to see how bad it can be to make people act and react accordingly so that we don't go down that left path, so to speak. Another book I want to quickly advertise, shameless advertising today, is this book. This was written by me and my wife, Tracy, called Advent Reflections. It's just like a little thin book, which goes through the 25 days of December. You're probably thinking, but Chris, there's more than 25 days of December. I know that, but really, are you going to read this after the 25th day of December? No, I thought not. So this is a little book, and each day has a devotion reflecting on things about Jesus, all sorts of different aspects. It's a really interesting book. And you go, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? Because it's your book. Well, no, my wife wrote it too. And it's a really interesting and novel look at the nativity that will really help you meditate on the wonder and the joy of this particular time of year. Okay, so as I said earlier, I wanted to talk a bit about recapturing the mystery of God. Now, we know some various famous scriptures. So, for example, in Psalm 139, it's that famous psalm which says, you know, where can I go from your presence? Where can I flee? Wherever I go, if I go down to Sheol, you're there. If I go to the highest mountain, you are there. Where can I flee from your presence? The fact that you are before me and behind me and you know all my days is too much for me to comprehend. It's a great psalm. I absolutely love it. And it's a great psalm to prove the omnipresence of God. The omnipresence, omni meaning everywhere and presence meaning presence. So the everywhere presence of God. God is everywhere. His presence is with us wherever we go. God is always present. And so this is something I kind of want to touch on a little bit here. God, did you know that God is always present? Well, yeah, theologically, we know that God is always present, but do you know that you can always experience God anytime, any place, anywhere? Often I find Christians who say things like, you know, I'm just not feeling the presence of God, and I'm not experiencing God in my life very much lately. Well, there may be various reasons for that. But for my own personal walk with God, even though I go through some really tough stuff and some really challenging times, I can honestly say that there's not really a day that goes by where I'm not aware of the goodness and the kindness of God and his holy presence that's around me. I'm aware of it all of the time. And I don't mean just theologically or theoretically, I mean practically. You see, it says in John chapter 17, verse 3, eternal life is knowing God. So normally when we try and sell eternal life to people, we're like, it's about living forever, isn't it, mate? No, it is that. But primarily, eternal life is knowing God and Jesus, the Son whom he sent. Now, what's interesting in that word knowing is in the Greek language, which the New Testament is written in, the word there for knowing is the same word of when a man knows a woman. So it's talking about that depth of intimacy. You see, this is something that Christianity has above every other faith. I was at this meeting last night. Me and my wife and our intern was invited to go around to this house of some people. They're not believers, but they wanted to talk about marriage and Christianity and things. And this is something that came up, this particular subject, and they needed to see that Christianity is not just something, a set of beliefs or an ideology. It's a living, active faith. And I had to say to them, there's no other religion on the earth that actually presents itself in such a way that it teaches that you can have an intimate relationship with the living God. There is no other faith that does that apart from the Christian faith, which is good. Now, in Romans 1, verses 19 to 20, I've inadvertently left my Bible somewhere where I can't get to it. So I can't go off camera to get to it. So I'm going to have to use my memory. But in Romans 1, verses 19 to 20, it talks about how creation reveals visibly the invisible attributes of God. Okay, so creation reveals visibly the invisible attributes of God. Psalm 19 is a great psalm. It talks about how the heavens declare the handiwork of God and reveal knowledge. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in the heavens, I'm talking astronomy, not astrology here, but in the heavens, there are 12 houses, 12 constellations, 12 houses, sorry. And in those 12 houses, which you get for each month, is the full outworking of the gospel story. So right at the beginning of time, the whole plan of God's salvation was already written in the heavens. That means that when Adam and Eve walked the garden, before they had even sinned, it was already written in the heavens that they were going to fall, but one would come that would redeem them and break the power of the serpent and would give them eternal life. That knowledge is written in the heavens. But you see, here's the problem with Christians. We have sanitized our Christianity so badly. We have stopped seeing the world with wonder and awe, to the point now we can't see the wood for the trees. I was saying in a sermon on the other Sunday, when Christians look at a tree, they go, "Oh, that's a nice tree, isn't it? Yeah, it's a pine tree, nice tree." And you might go, "Well, did you know that the cellular structure of the pine tree is a large cellular structure, which means it's a softwood? But if it was a hard or dense wood like mahogany, the cellular structure would be much more tight and small." And it's like, well, good for you. Good for you. You know how a tree is made cellular on a structural basis. But it's the difference between science and philosophy. Science can tell you maybe how something is made, but it won't tell you why. Okay? And that's another thing. Atheists are figuring this out. They thought that science was the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But actually, science isn't. Because science is a certain discipline to do certain things. But it doesn't answer the big questions as to why am I here? So you're looking at a tree. What is that tree telling you? Well, I don't know. I can't see the wood for the trees. It's just a tree. It's a pretty tree. Look, a pretty tree. Okay, but actually, the Bible's teaching us is that, as I said, about the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and the heavens are declaring knowledge. The heavens are declaring the salvation story, always has been up there since the beginning of time. Okay, before Adam and Eve even fell, get your head around that. That's why it says in Revelation 4 that Jesus is the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the earth. God knew when he created this whole thing. He knew from the get-go. Nothing surprises God. He knew what was going to happen. He'd already prepared the way of salvation. So when we then look at a tree, for example, according to Romans 1 and according to Psalm 19, creation is teaching us visibly and revealing things to us visibly the invisible attributes of God. Now, I ran a prayer school for a while, for about a year at our church, and we had all sorts of people come from all over the place, even as far as London. And I was teaching people how to do some of those ancient disciplines, things like Lectio Divina, and various other things. And one of the things that I occasionally did was I'd bring in bits of plants and I'd say, okay, we're going to meditate on a leaf today. And they'd kind of like look at me like, what? Okay. Because I had to say to them, look, all creation is revealing visibly the invisible attributes of God. What are the invisible attributes of God? Well, the fact that God is holy, the fact that God is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, the fact that he is all of these things, and he's all powerful and all pervading. Now, I don't teach that God is in creation because that's pantheism and panentheism, which is heresy. Okay, but the Bible does teach that all creation reveals something of God to us. But the problem is that we live in this very sanitized, whitewashed, wishy-washy, boil in the bag type Christianity, where we just don't see the mystery of the world because we can no longer see the wood for the trees. So I in this prayer school, I gave everyone, I bought in a big bag of leaves, handed them out to everybody. And they're like, okay, what am I going to do with it? I said, you need to meditate on it and see what God is saying about what these things are revealing to you. And it's always interesting. So for me, a clover leaf. Okay, now you think, I don't know if you've seen a clover leaf up close and personal, but on the farm that we have, there's quite a lot of clover that grows up there. And you pick it up, and it has these 3 leaves, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But on each leaf is this white thing. And that when the 3 leaves come together, this white lines form a perfect equilateral triangle. Ooh, big word there, triangle. And so it forms this perfect triangle. And there you see the mystery of the Trinity. 3 persons, but it forms one singular triangle. So there's only one God, but 3 persons of the Trinity. And that's in a clover leaf, which you just walk on with your feet. And then you pick these things up and you look at them and you see that all creation is screaming, God, 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 all of the time. For example, another thing, and so back to the prayer school, I got them to meditate, I think, on some leaves. And we had some leaves, the ones with the 5 prongs. Maple leaves, I believe they're called. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not an expert on trees, but there we go. And so we meditated on these leaves that had like these 5 fingers on them. And of course, you think about these things. Well, what does 5 represent biblically? Well, 5 is the number of grace. We know that 5 is the number of books in the Torah. We know in the New Testament we have the Gospels and the book of Acts, which is like the kind of like the New Testament, not version of the Torah, but like the New Testament, new beginnings in respect of reinterpreting Torah, I suppose. And then we have oak leaves, which have 5 fingers one side and 5 fingers the other side. So again, now you have law and grace and all these other things. And it just all these wonderful things and revelations that come out of creation. And all of a sudden you start looking at the natural world with a very different look. And that look that we're supposed to really see the world is in what we call a sacramental way of seeing creation. So there's several words for you, big words for the day, theological terms. We've got a theophany, a Christophany, and a hierophany. Okay, so a theophany is where God manifests himself in some way. And so we see this in the Old Testament, where God, when he was leading the Israelites through the wilderness, so for 40 years, he appeared as a column of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. That's called a theophany, okay? The other one is a Christophany. So this is where Jesus appears. He appears often in the Old Testament as in cameo roles, sometimes as the angel of the Lord, sometimes as the word of the Lord. So I think it's in Genesis 15, it says, or 14, it says, the word of the Lord came to Abraham saying. We know that according to John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, And then I think it's verse 14 or 17 in the same chapter, the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. So the word of the Lord, if you read the prophets, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, the word of the Lord came to Hezekiah, all these, not Hezekiah, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, etc. So this is not like, oh, the word of the Lord came to him, like, oh, it's a prophecy, I just received the word of the Lord. It's actually, no, it's the manifestation of the word of the Lord, which is Jesus. So that's called a Christophany. And then the other word, which you may not be familiar with, is a hierophany. Now, hierophany is where we can experience something of the divine from the natural world around us. And so this brings us into this way that we can approach the Bible and the world in which we live in, which is learning to live in wonder, which is really what the guy is saying in this book, learning to see the world in wonder. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my story. Some of you are already aware of this, that I've come from witchcraft to Christ. When I was 17, I'm now 52. I came from witchcraft to Christ. That's my story, where I had several encounters with Jesus Christ. I'll share a few minutes on that, if I may. So I was involved in witchcraft. I was in a really dark place. I was having regular demonic apparitions appearing to me, all sorts of stuff. And then one day I woke up going to sleep, and I woke up, I don't know when it was, probably in the middle of the night. And at the end of my bed was God and the devil. And they were having a talk about who would get my soul. Devil, he just looked like a kind of a normal guy. I wasn't really paying much attention to him, but it was God that grabbed my attention. And it was like this swirling spiral galaxy of galaxies of energy and light pouring forth, okay, into my room. And as I gazed upon, let's see the light there. I get complaints about too much light shining off my glasses. I've rearranged the light so that it doesn't happen. But anyway, just for effect, I'm going to look into the light, okay? And as I tried to look into the light of the glory of God, my eyes just kept falling off him because he was too holy. He was too perfect, and I just couldn't do it. It physically pained me to look upon the living God, but it was so magnificent to see this manifestation of the glory of God in my bedroom of all places. Anyway, so that kind of happened, and I kind of just forgot about it, because again, I had a lot of weird experiences with the demonic growing up. So this was unusual, but not unusual in one sense. It was unusual that it was God that was doing this, but not unusual to have these kind of apparitions appearing before me. And then one day I was coming home from the woods where I'd done a witchcraft ritual. And there, the voice of Jesus spoke to me, and he said, will you stop what you're doing? Come to know me. You can be forgiven for this. Now, I didn't really understand quite what he meant, but I knew in the instant that he spoke to me, and bear in mind, I had no religious upbringing. I had no interest in God, didn't want to know God. I was happy doing witchcraft. Thank you very much. And then the voice of God speaks to me. And in the instant that he speaks to me, I knew instantly that he was Jesus. I knew instantly that he was God. And I knew instantly that he was the creator of everything. This happened several times. I didn't really understand what he was saying, and I kept ignoring what he was saying. And this happened several times. But eventually, I got the point and gave my life to Jesus. But then, having been involved in witchcraft, my life did take then a turn for the worse, because I suffered from really bad bouts of depression. It was a demonic kind of depression. Now, I know there's different types of depression out there, but mine was demonic. So I would just be sat there quite happy, and I'd just feel this darkness just descend upon me. And then when that darkness descended upon me, I just would want to do things like kill myself. There was no rhyme or reason for it, okay? This was not normal depression. This was really quite dark, macabre depression. And I found one night, I was like, I'm going to get into my car and go kill myself. It was probably about 11 o'clock at night. I drove up to Portsdown Hill, near where I live, found a good place to drive off the edge. And went up to the roundabout, drove the car up to full speed, which is only about 60 miles an hour. It was an old thing. And whoosh, straight off the edge of the road. And as the car was flying, hurtling through the air, I was expecting to feel death and pain. And I had my eyes shut. And then suddenly the whole car just immediately flooded with pure white light. And I remember being bathed in this white light. And then suddenly this sense of peace overcame me. And then I blacked out. When I came to, the car had crashed on its nose and then landed on its roof, and it was completely written off. And I came to upside down in the car, completely unhurt, not a scratch. I was so annoyed because I hadn't succeeded. And as I got out the car, I heard again the voice of God saying, "You're not dying because you've got work to do." And I clambered up the hill and got in, and then suddenly this car pulls up, and there's a man inside a car, a bearded man. Yeah, I get the stereotypes. And he just said to me, "Would you like a lift home?" And I was like, "Yes, please." And I get into the car. I get into the car, not gets. I get into the car, and I didn't tell him where I lived. And suddenly everything became very dreamlike and blurry. And he just drove me straight to my house, straight to my door, and then off he went. No questions. I don't remember him asking me a single question because I was streaked with blood and not blood, sorry, with dirt. And he just didn't ask a question. Like, why did you just clamber up that hill? Why are you covered in mud? Just drove me to my door. So that was my introduction to Christianity, and I could tell you some stories that would probably turn your hair white. So my experience of Christianity is way beyond what I would call the norm. That doesn't mean I'm someone special, but what it means is that I have a perspective that I learned very quickly that most Christians lack. And and as I was growing up as a Christian, I found that really hard. That I was experiencing spiritual realities of God and the spiritual realm that's around us and the spiritual world. And most Christians, for the most part, had no experience of it. And not only no experience, but didn't want to know anything about it either. That to me was problematic. And then I would be encountering Christians that was like, I'd say, "Oh, God said this to me," or "God said that to me." And I'd have people saying, "Well, I've been a Christian for 30 years and I've never heard God speak to me once." And I'm like, whoa, there's something, either I am abnormal here, which probably many people would agree with, or there is something wrong with them. And I think in part it's because Christians have used their intellect to such a point that they have literally talked themselves out of the supernatural. You see, just prior to the Reformation, we had the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment movement, that kind of spread from Italy out across Europe. And about the same time, just a little bit later, came the Reformation. And so the Reformation and this Enlightenment movement kind of blurred the edges and came together and joined forces in many respects. And it changed how we think to make the Western world, especially in Britain and Europe, a weird bunch of people. That we started looking at the world from an intellectual point of view. And with the Reformation, we gutted the church of its spirituality. We said because it's like a divorce between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholics were like, well, the Protestants were like, "Hey, Catholics, you can keep all your saints, you can keep all your supernatural weirdo stuff, and we're going to go for Reformed theology and doctrine and all that cerebral stuff. That's what we're going to go for." And so consequently, the church intellectualized themselves out of the miraculous. And I find that we're still walking in the hangovers of that today. And I find a lot of Christians that really can't cope with a supernatural element to their faith, which I think is utterly incredulous, to the point now where I come across a lot of so-called Pentecostal charismatic churches that are Pentecostal and charismatic in name only. And they think they're charismatic because they've got the big loud worship band and a smoke machine and lights. And hey, that's what makes us charismatic, right? No, charismatic comes from the Greek word charismata, which means gifts of grace. It means as a church, if you want to have the badge of being a charismatic church, you need to be operating in charismatic gifts, okay, as listed in 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. If you're not operating in those gifts, then you're no different from a church that's possibly even cessationist, okay? You can't claim that you're charismatic. You can't even claim if you're Pentecostal. I know some Pentecostal churches that don't even speak in tongues. And I mean, that's what Pentecostal churches do, right? Crazy days in which we're living in. So in our history in Britain, if we go back like, I don't know, to like say 1,800, 1,700 years ago, when the Celtic Christians came to this nation. Well, they weren't Celtic Christians, but they were Christians that came from the eastern bloc of the world, came to us, and they basically got many of the Celts saved or born again. And it was those Celtic Christians that moved on in this remarkable way where they saw the world in a very different way from us. So, for example, Celtic Christians would go into a zone or an area, and they would find the most demonized, darkest area, which is what Christians wouldn't do these days, and they would pray in that area until they made it what they call a thin space, where it's so prayed in that the presence of God is there. And once it's established, then they would they would build a monastery. And they would then make a center of prayer and a resource center and a mission center. And then from there, they would send people out. And from those people that got sent out, then they would plant churches. And so the monastery became the central powerhouse or prayer powerhouse to those churches that were then built round about. But we don't think like that anymore. We don't think about things like thin spaces, no, God doesn't do that. No, we are the church. God's not interested in spaces and buildings and all that nonsense. No, it's all about us. We're the church and God lives in us, and it's got nothing to do with external realities. Except that just isn't true, because you see, God is immutable. As much as he said to Moses, "Oi, take those sandals off, because where you're treading is holy ground," that's as true then as it is today. There are places that are still sacred spaces. A while ago, I went to a place called Ashburnham Place. If you're aware of it, it's a lovely place. And there's a prayer room there that's been prayed in for about 100 years. Now, the guy that was running the place, he said to me, "I'll come and show you our prayer room." So I went to the prayer room. And he said, "Can you just stand in this part of the room here?" And I was a bit weird. It's like, "What, here?" No, just to the left bit, right bit, forward bit. And he positioned me into this one single spot in the room. Okay. And I was like, and he said, and then he just sort of backed away from me. Okay. And as I was stood there thinking, what's going on? Suddenly this wave of emotion just poured over me. It felt like a bucket of water or a bucket of emotion just being poured over me. And I just felt myself welling up, and I wanted to cry. And I'd give it a few more seconds and I would have done it. And the guy said to me, "Hey, what are you feeling?" And I said, "I feel like I'm overwhelmed. I'm about to cry." And he went, "That's it. That's what you should be feeling. Let's go." And he dragged me out of the room. It basically, there was a specific spot in the room, which was a thin space where the presence of God just continually resided there. And if you stood in that spot, you would be hit by the living presence of the living God. Again, that kind of theology or that kind of experience is lost on many Christians. Oh, no. It's not about, God's not into buildings. God doesn't do buildings. But what about buildings that have been prayed in for 1,000 years or 700 years? That has to mean something, right? That has to mean something. This prayer room here, I've been praying in this prayer room now for about 20 years, I think. It's only now that I can come into here, and at a certain point, which is actually just there, if I come there in the morning, because I put a little altar there in the mornings, and I pray there, I get this thick sense, weighty sense of the presence of God. It's taken a long time to have a room that's being prayed in where the presence of God now just turns up when I turn up. I don't need to work it up. I don't need to drum it up. But again, this is not something that modern Christians are comfortable with, because they're so intelligent, they've rationalized everything out. Oh, no, theologically, that doesn't happen. No. God's not into buildings. That's Catholic nonsense. But actually, excuse me, God is immutable, which means he's unchanging. And if he did it in the Old Testament, he's going to do it in the New Testament. I remember I went to a cathedral in Norwich. There was a guy taking us on a tour, which we'd paid for. And we come to this part of the altar, huge altar. And there was this tunnel that went through the back of the altar. And the guy was saying that back in the day when they used to do pilgrimages, which was a long time ago, people used to come through there. People who were sick would crawl through the tunnel. And when they got to just underneath the part of the altar where the Eucharistic host was, if they touched that part of the altar, God would heal them. And the guy doing the tour guide, he said, do you think it worked? And everyone was like, no, it's just medieval superstitious nonsense. And he was like, au contraire. He said, you have little faith. He said, this place used to be full of walking sticks and various other things where people had been miraculously healed, because it was It was that point of faith, that point of contact, a point of the building where it had been prayed over and was deemed holy and sacred. And that when people went there and they touched it, they got healed. Now, some people go, "Oh, Chris, that sounds like Catholic superstitious nonsense." I don't know. But I have seen enough things in my own short Christian walk to know that I'm not going to put God in my nice little neat theological box. That I've seen God do some pretty weird stuff. Did you know, for example, that there was a big survey done on this, that the most miracles take place not in healing services, not in big healing evangelistic crusades, but before the Eucharist. That's the communion. That's where most miracles take place. It's interesting, isn't it? Because as Protestants now, we believe that the bread and wine is in memory only, and it means nothing more than just a piece of bread and a bit of juice. But maybe there's something a bit more going on there. Even my own wife, she had a bone disease where she was suffering from hypermobility for about 20 years, to the point where she was just in constant agony, and it was getting really bad. And we went to a leaders meeting, and we're at this leaders meeting, and they serve communion. And as my wife reached out to touch the communion chalice, instantly this warm energy just flowed through her body, and she was instantly and miraculously cured. I've read many books about people doing healing services in front of the Eucharist and people getting radically healed. Why is this? Because again, our rationalistic Protestant mindset has lost something along the way. We've lost the wonder and the mystique of our own Christian faith. Now, what else? Also, another thing, the concept of pilgrimage. That's really important and really special. In the good old days, you'd have like Celtic crosses all over, stone ones all over Great Britain, and these would be almost like, not shrines, that would be the wrong word, but places where people would come to pray on their journeys to going to a cathedral or something like that. But these places became thin spaces where people would go there and they would pray, and they'd encounter something of the presence of God. And again, in our so-called technological age, we have lost so much. You know, as Christians, we think we have so much. We think we're like the creme of the crop because we have all this biblical knowledge, and we have an app for that, and we have AI, and we can access any information that we could ever wish for. And that's the problem. You're too left-brained in your approach to the world. You see, the right side of the brain deals with things like intuition. It deals with what we would call more the spiritual aspects. It's also what deals with music and arts and creativity. And it's also what helps you perceive your place in the world. It's also that part of the brain that lets you know when something's wrong, even though you don't know what is wrong, but you know something's off somewhere. Especially if you meet someone, like something's saying to you, something wrong about this person. You need to trust that, because that's the right side of your brain telling you. But we've become so left brain orientated, where it's all about rationalism and it's all about intellectualism. We can no longer see the wood for the trees, and we're no longer seeing the world in what it is, in that the whole world is a hierophany. The whole world is something to be experienced. The whole world is revealing visibly the invisible attributes of God, and it's waiting for you to experience something of God through it. Hallelujah. But because of our modern detached world, I started this talk about farming, and in many respects it comes back to that, because as Christians we are so detached from our own world, it's not funny. Did you know there's an enzyme in soil, dirt, that when you work the ground, the soil releases an enzyme, which is something that triggers a happy thing in your brain that makes you have a sense of well-being. That's in the soil. In other words, man is supposed to get his hands dirty with the soil. But we live in this very advanced technological age. Christians have lost touch with the world around them. They've lost touch with creation. They barely go to see it. They barely go in it. And when they do, it's just like, hey, let's go for a walk in the park and, ooh, look, a tree. But not appreciating the hierophany that's going on around them, where the whole world is saying you can have an experience of Jesus Christ everywhere you go. Hallelujah. I love Mother Teresa. She always used to say, whenever she sees somebody, she would see Christ within that person. And because she was taking Matthew 25 literally, where Jesus said, if you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. And she saw that man is made in the image of God, and therefore man reveals and reflects something of God. And so she would treat man with that dignity and that respect that came from the Imago Dei, which is the image of God. We live in such a rationalized world now that we don't really see the spiritual side much. There's not many churches that do deliverance ministry anymore. We've had people as far as Ireland, all sorts of places, Scotland, coming to our church to get healing and deliverance ministry because many churches will not do it. I think many churches will not do it because they don't know how to do it. And also many churches won't do it because they don't believe in it. They would rather sit you down and give you a counseling session, which is teaching you how to live with your problems, than to actually be healed and have deliverance, either demonically or from trauma, or deliverance from things that have been afflicting your life. And that's a shame. That's a shame when our rationalistic mindset culture has infected our Christianity to such a degree that we no longer live in a world of the supernatural. It's a shame. It's such a shame. And so when I came from witchcraft to Christ, I could see the world through that lens. My whole childhood saw the world through that lens. And even now as an adult, I struggle sometimes. I'm not as good at it as I used to be, but I still see the world through that lens. And it's a wonderful world. It's also a very scary world. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there. But there's a whole world where God is wanting to reveal himself to you in different ways. Remember, God isn't in creation, but creation is revealing the visible attributes of the invisible God. So you should look at the world that you're living in with awe. When you come to the communion table, see it for what it is. It is a sacrament. A sacrament is something that is physical, but somehow it's revealing something deeply spiritual. And when I say spiritual, I'm not talking about like an intellectual kind of spiritual, like, oh, yes, it's a spiritual thing. No, it's a spiritual thing, meaning it's a real thing. Something real is going on there. It's a bit like marriage. Marriage is a sacrament. And so when you Bible says, he who obtains a wife or a good wife he who gets himself a good wife obtains favor from the Lord. So in other words, get a wife, and then you can obtain favor from the Lord. In other words, your marriage, which is a natural thing, is imputing and imparting a grace to you, because blessed is the one who finds a good wife, for he shall obtain favor. That's the grace and the mercy and the kindness of God, just because you're married. Why? Because marriage represents Christ and his church. And this is why we see marriage as being a sacrament. And so it ministers a grace to you. There's a grace for people who are married that you don't get when you're single. That's not to say you don't get certain other types of grace for being single, because you do, because Paul says that, there's a grace to be single. But this is what I'm talking about. It's like baptism. People just chuck them in, get them out. Yay, well done. You're a Christian now, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, hang on a minute. No, baptism is way more significant than us Westerners really value and appreciate. Think about this. And I'll kind of close on this because the show will be over soon. When Moses came before Pharaoh, okay, and Moses had his staff, the one that turned into a snake, you need to understand something here. Now, again, in our rationalistic mindset, we look at the court of Moses and go, oh, yes, Moses had magicians, but they're probably just charlatans and conjurers and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely not. Let me tell you something now, Christian, okay? As coming from witchcraft to Christ, let me tell you something now. That witchcraft stuff is real. It's powerful. They do things like transmutate creatures from one creature into something else, okay? You might think that's the stuff of science fiction, or that's the stuff of fantasy TV. No, this stuff is real. But the fact that you don't want to believe that, the fact that you don't know that, is neither here nor there. Satanic power is real. And so when Moses came into the courts of Pharaoh, he knew that he was coming into the seat of a man who claimed to be God, with magicians that were around him that could really do strange and demonic stuff. So Moses, he had to know where he came into Pharaoh's court, that he had greater power and greater authority than they had. And again, this is completely lost in today's Christian culture. You read these stories and go, oh yeah, he just came into Pharaoh's courts. No, this was literally a power of the gods. Whose God is more powerful? They didn't have this intellectual worldview that we have, because our worldview is weird. The world has never looked in the way that it does at the world the way we have, the way we do now. It never used to be like that. Only a couple of 100 years ago. But before that, no one ever thought the way that we do. We are actually, although we're very intelligent people and we're very knowledgeable, we're actually really dumb and stupid when it comes to the things of the Spirit. So Moses is coming before Pharaoh. And he says, got to let my people go. And he puts his staff down. It turns into a snake. Whoa, clever trick. But then the magicians, the wizards, they put down their staffs and they turn into snakes. This is real. This is transmutation, going from one thing into something else. It's real. It happens all the time. And so there's this shape-shifting stick, and now it's turned into a snake. But Moses' staff gobbles up those two snakes. And then it becomes a staff again, and he holds it up. In other words, as Christians, you need to understand that Jesus gave you power over snakes and scorpions, over all the power of the enemy, and nothing by any means shall harm you. And you need to know this is not some abstract theological point, but this is real, miraculous, supernatural power. Now, I'm not saying that we jettison our brain and we become stupid people and really superstitious and, there's a demon here and there's a demon there. But you need to understand that there's an aspect to our faith which we have lost, and we need to reclaim it back. And we need to come back to the wonder of Christianity. We need to come back to learning how to live in wonder. I strongly recommend that you get this book. You may not agree with everything this guy says, because he's coming from the Greek Orthodox, which is kind of, so you got Catholic, Orthodox, and then Protestant. They're really the three major denominations. So he's coming from the Orthodox point of view, but he raises some very interesting points. As Christians, we did away with our stained glass windows. We did away with candles. We did away with incense. Instead, we replaced them with bland whitewashed buildings, colored lights, and a smoke machine. We have taken away and ripped ourselves of the beauty of the divine. Why churches had stained glass windows and icons and art? So that people could come and meditate on those things and ponder the deep mysteries of God. We have an artist in our church who paints some beautiful pictures for us, and we hang them up, and people can just look at those pictures and have some revelation of something of God, which is deeply profound. Anyway, that's all I have time for this week. Hope you've enjoyed this week's show. And until next time, God bless you all. This is Reverend Chris Wickland signing out. See you again next week. God bless. Bye-bye.